So today's going to be a little bit of a combination of review as well as an introduction to the endocrine system, because we're going to be switching over to body systems, focusing on endocrine system, immune system, and nerve system. So let's do a little bit of communication review, because again, remember that's one of the main jobs of our endocrine system, is our hormones act as chemical messengers. So let's think of some reasons why cells communicate. Okay, so some of the reasons why cells may need to communicate is they need to coordinate activities. And this is particularly important in a multicellular organism. Okay, so your multicellular organisms, for example humans, need to coordinate activities between all the different cells so that they can be a successful organism. Okay, so one of the other reasons why cells may need to communicate with one another would be that they need to find a mate. Okay, if y'all remember yeast cells, they release those factors to be able to find a mate. Okay, and so when they receive that signal, that would tell them that it was mating time. Another one would be apoptosis. Okay, so remember apoptosis was cell death. Okay, so that's a programmed cell death for whatever reason. Okay, the cell is committing suicide. It's infected. Something wasn't transcribed properly. Whatever. Okay, all of those would be a reason why cells would need to communicate. As well as cell recognition. Okay, it needs to be able to recognize the cells that are around it. Okay, hormone action. Okay, so this would be what hormones do. Okay, hormones are responsible for acting as chemical messengers. Okay, as well as turning pathways on and off. Okay, that's what we were talking about with our G proteins and tyrosine kinases. Okay, we had those cells that were communicating and talking to one another. So these are all reasons why cells would need to communicate. And one of the things we need to keep in mind is that our basic communication, our basic cell communication, the processes that go with it, okay, is similar across the board. Okay, this is one of our evolutionary links. We'll be looking for these throughout the units. And prokaryotes, eukaryotes, okay, they all have this basic similar form of cell communication. They will do that for a form of signal transduction, where they are converting the signal into the cellular response. Okay, so it's one of those another pieces of evidence, that links evolutionary-wise everything together. So cells can communicate both inside and outside of the body. Some examples of cell communication outside of the body would be pheromones and quorum sensing. We're going to talk about each one of those individually. And then some examples of cell communication inside of the body would be short distance communication, like we talked briefly about paracrine communication. We're also going to talk about autocrine communication, and then as well as endocrine communication, or the long distance communication with the hormones. So let's talk about each one of these individually. Let's talk about pheromones for just a second. So pheromones are chemicals that aid in the communication by members of the same species. So for example, how a bee talks to a bee. They can do a variety of things. They can mark trails for food. Okay, so they can mark out trails for other organisms of their same species to follow to get to food. They can define or mark out territory, so they can act as a warning system. They can also, like I said, be used as a warning system to help warn predators, not just to warn other members of their same species with their defining territory. They can also be used to help attract a mate. Okay. So we're going to try to embed a little video in here of this gentleman is running an experiment regarding pheromones, and he's going to show how this termite will follow the pheromone path. I know you're watching all this. I'm sorry.
Okay, for what we're about to do, you're going to need three things: a plain blank white sheet of paper and a Papermate pen. It's very important it is a Papermate brand pen, because other types of ink will not work for this. And what you want to do is draw a trail, just any kind of curving, winding trail, something like that. And the third thing you're going to need might be a bit hard to find, but you might have access to them: a termite or several termites. And here we have a tank with a few. And What you're about to see is pretty interesting. If I shake one termite onto there, we'll give it a few seconds. Now you can see that the termite stays on the trail, and it may pace back and forth, but it generally keeps right on it and may follow it to the end. And this is because the scent in paper-mate pens is almost identical to termite pheromones. So this termite is trying to detect another termite, get back to the colony by following the ink trail. And they'll do this 5 or 6 times, pace back and forth. By the time the ink dries out, they'll usually give up and head off, but it will stay there following it for quite some time.
So you can see how the termite thought that the ink from the pen was communication from another termite, telling it how to get back to its home. So quorum sensing is done by bacteria, and it's done to help get the bacteria that are living in the same area to act as a group, so they can have a group reaction. So the bacteria are constantly monitoring their environment. They're constantly producing what are called autoinducers. So they're producing and they're monitoring and they're checking these autoinducers. And so what this does is it allows the bacteria to monitor their environment. And they can monitor for what other bacteria are there, how many bacteria are there, and then they can alter or change their behavior as a population. So on a population level, they can change and they can have a response to either the number or the type of bacteria present. So y'all don't need to memorize this picture or anything. I just want you to see that you've got quorum sensing happening here. These two bacteria are going to interact with one another and have a collaborative type of response. So cell communication can also take place inside of the body. In your multicellular organisms, those cells need to be able to speak and communicate with one another so that the organism can function as a whole. And so one of the ways that they can do that is through direct contact. Remember in plants, that was those plasmodesmata. Right there, those gaps in the cell wall that allowed for exchange between the cytoplasm. Remember in animal cells, those were called gap junctions. They allowed for, again, direct cytoplasmic exchange between the two cells that were touching one another. You also have what are called helper T cells in the immune system. We will do the immune system in a little bit. And these helper T cells are going to work with the killer T cells. They're going to directly contact and talk to the killer T cells so they can go take care of whatever invader is there. So cells can communicate directly with physical contact with one another. They can also communicate over short distances. When they communicate over short distances, we've got two examples here, paracrine and autocrine. And we've talked about paracrine already before, but we'll look at it a little bit further. Remember, paracrine is when they act on cells that are nearby. Whatever's secreted acts on cells that are close. And autocrine is when they act on the secretion, acts on the cell that actually secreted it. So we'll look at both of these in some pictures. So let's do a little paracrine communication review. Remember, paracrine communication acts on the nearby cells. So you have your cell that is secreting whatever substance it is, and it's going to act on cells that are nearby. They don't have to get into the bloodstream and travel, and that will elicit whatever response it's going to get from those cells. So some of the examples we've mentioned were what are called prostaglandins. Prostaglandins have a wide variety of functions. I've just given you a few here. They can constrict or dilate, which means they can change the size, the shape of the smooth muscles, particularly in the blood vessels. Okay, so that would make the blood vessels either more narrow or wider. They can induce labor, uterine contractions. They can monitor cell growth, and they can produce fever in your brain. They're important for platelet aggregation or disaggregation. So basically the formation of the platelets coming together and clumping together to form the clot, as well as breaking apart to dissolve the clot. They deal with pain, monitoring the pain response. So prostaglandins have a very wide variety of functions, but they're acting on cells that are nearby. Another example would be neurotransmitters. The example we will focus on the most would be acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction. You've got plenty of other neurotransmitters that are available to you, dopamine, serotonin, GABA. Okay, but we're going to focus, like I said, on acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is released from the neurons, and it works on the motor end plate of the muscle cell, which is right there in the vicinity. So it's inducing a response from nearby tissue. So autocrine signals work on the cell that secreted it. So obviously it doesn't have very far to go to elicit their response. And so two examples that we have here would be interleukin-1, which is produced by monocytes. Monocytes we'll talk about more when we talk about the immune system. So this is an immune system chemical. But they're produced by the monocytes, and they bind to receptors on the same monocyte. So basically they perpetuate and encourage that immune response to happen. And same with tumor cells. Okay? Tumor cells reproduce uncontrollably because they self-stimulate. They self-stimulate cell division. They make their own division signals. When cells are going through mitosis and they're dividing, they go through a variety of checkpoints and signals that tell them to divide. And tumor cells can send their own signals telling the cell to divide, even when normally it would not. So hormones are going to do our long-distance communication. So these are going to be chemical messengers. They're going to trigger those signal transduction pathways. They're going to have to travel through the circulatory system to be able to cause their effect. They're going to go to a different part of the body. Okay? If we look here, you can see that your cell here, your endocrine gland, released the hormone. The hormone traveled through the blood vessel, okay, and then it would cause a response on cells a long distance away. Okay? So these are going to activate transduction pathways. Remember, transduction pathways are ones that they will change that response, they'll change that signal into a cellular response. They may require a second messenger, they may turn into transcription factors, they may be done many, many times. Okay, so wide variety of things going on here with the transduction pathway. So some of the things that's going to be required for this hormone to work is you're going to have a secreting cell. You're going to have a cell that's going to actually spit out some hormone here. Okay, so you have to have a secreting cell. You have to have the signal. Okay, and if y'all remember, the signal is called a ligand in simplified terms. Remember, the ligand was in general anything that signaled another cell. So the secreting cell secretes the ligand, which in this case would be a hormone. Okay, there has to be receptors. If there's no receptors, then it can't trigger the target cell. So there's the secreting cell that's going to release the signal, the ligand, which is the signal, the receptor that's going to be on the target cell, and the target cell is where that hormone's eventually going to end up. For example, insulin. So insulin is a hormone that is secreted by the pancreas. Okay, and so when that hormone is secreted by the pancreas, it stimulates the cells to remove glucose from the bloodstream. So if we start applying this vocabulary that we just talked about, we would have our secreting cell. Okay, in this case, our secreting cell would be sorry about that. Okay, in this case, our secreting cell would be the beta cell. Oh, I can't spell today either. It would be the beta cell in the pancreas. So that's my secreting cell. Insulin is going to be my ligand, so that's what would be secreted from the beta cell of the pancreas. Okay, the receptor is going to be on the target cell, which in this case would be my skeletal muscle. Okay, so my skeletal muscle that's going to pull that glucose out of the bloodstreams to lower the blood glucose level. And then my receptor, okay, would just be an integral protein that is specific to skeletal muscle cells, so it can bind to the insulin can trigger it. Remember, there's lots of different ways. Hormones can cause different responses on different kinds of cells, and that's for a variety of reasons. They can have, the cell itself can have different proteins inside of it that get triggered. The receptor may be different, but hormones do not elicit the exact same response in every single kind of cell. So let's look at the endocrine system itself. So the endocrine system consists of glands that are going to secrete hormones. And you don't have to have necessarily all of the glands and all of the hormones memorized. What you are going to need is we're going to need a very, very thorough understanding of one particular hormone. We will hone in on insulin and glucagon for feedback loops. So you guys will be choosing a different hormone that you are going to kind of specialize in. So the hypothalamus is technically not a pituitary gland. It's not really releasing hormones per se, but it does have a major impact on the pituitary gland, and we'll look at it in just a second. So it's usually lumped in there with the endocrine system. The pineal gland, there in the brain. One of the hormones that comes out of the pineal gland would be melatonin. Melatonin is important for our sleep-wake cycles. So that would come from that pineal gland there. That's just an I, N-I-N. Below that, with the pituitary gland hanging from the brain, wide variety of hormones. Pituitary gland is split into an anterior and posterior pituitary. We'll talk about a couple of hormones that come from each one of those in just a minute. The thyroid gland has T3, T4, calcitonin. So thyroxine, the calcitonin that's going to lower blood calcium levels. Parathyroid glands have parathyroid hormone. So parathyroid hormone, which will actually help raise blood calcium levels. The pancreas secretes the insulin and glucagon. The ovaries of the female secrete estrogens, progestins. The males, the testes, will secrete the androgens. For example, testosterone. Estrogens more in the female, and progestins. We also have other organs that will secrete hormones. They contain parts of the organ would contain endocrine hormone secreting cells. For example, with the thymus, you secrete thymosin. The kidneys secrete renin and erythropoietin, which have an impact on blood pressure. I did realize I missed your adrenal glands over here on top of the kidneys, which are going to secrete epinephrine, norepinephrine, your glucocorticoids and mineral corticoids, your steroids. They're going to raise, they can raise blood glucose levels. They'll help your kidneys deal with salt balance. So we've got a wide variety of functions with these hormones. And like I said, you don't have to memorize every single hormone and gland. So these hormones will work together to do long-term regulation of your body responses. So the nervous system will do short-term regulation, and when the endocrine system will then take over and do long-term regulation. So the endocrine system has an impact on mood, growth and development, metabolism, sleep, just a wide variety of things, while it's working with the nervous system to help control and regulate and maintain homeostasis. So let's take a look at how the nervous system and the endocrine system would work together. We're going to focus just on the hypothalamus and the pituitary region. So as you can see here, so this is the hypothalamus region. The pituitary hangs below it. And so the pituitary is divided into an anterior and posterior. So you can see this is our posterior pituitary here. So this is the anterior pituitary here. And so there's the hypothalamic releasing hormones there. So in the anterior pituitary, it is going to interact with the hypothalamus because the anterior pituitary is going to release its hormones based upon what the hypothalamus tells it to do. So the hypothalamus will stimulate or inhibit that anterior pituitary. Let's take an example here. So the anterior pituitary secretes what's called prolactin. And so prolactin has an impact on the mammary glands. it's going to encourage the production of milk and the secretion of milk in mammals. So its target cells are the mammary glands of mammals. The hormone here is prolactin that's secreted from the anterior pituitary. But the hypothalamus secretes what's called prolactin releasing hormone. And so that hypothalamus is what actually tells the pituitary to release the prolactin. Another example would be thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, so the anterior pituitary secretes thyroid stimulating hormone that goes and stimulates the thyroid gland, so that the thyroid gland can secrete thyroxine and triiodothyronine. So the thyroid gland is indirectly controlled by the hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus is what told the pituitary gland to secrete the thyroid stimulating hormone in the first place. Many of the hormones that come from the anterior pituitary are what are called tropic hormones. And so a tropic hormone is one that's going to stimulate or control other glands. So they stimulate, they control other glands or organs. For example, you have FSH and LH. Those are tropic hormones, follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone. Those stimulate, as a general, the gonads. They may stimulate the secretion of estrogen or testosterone. Thyroid stimulating hormone here, that would stimulate the thyroid gland to secrete thyroxine. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, that's going to go stimulate the adrenal cortex. So it's going to get the adrenal glands going. So the anterior pituitary secretes a lot of these tropic hormones that will stimulate and control others. The posterior pituitary gland is going to store and release hormones that the hypothalamus itself made. So those two systems, the nervous system and endocrine system, are working together again. So here's my hypothalamus. My posterior pituitary, like I said, stores and then, based on information from the hypothalamus, will release what's called oxytocin and ADH. So oxytocin, again, interacts, its target cell is the mammary glands, like the prolactin. This encourages the milk letdown from the mammary glands and the uterine muscles during labor. It will stimulate the uterine contractions. ADH is antidiuretic hormone. If I could spell today. So ADH, again, is antidiuretic hormone. That's an E that we're trying to get there. And so an antidiuretic hormone promotes water retention of the kidneys. It encourages your kidneys to hold on to water, so basically encourages you not to go to the bathroom. So if we thought about what, if this got disrupted, what could happen? For example, alcohol decreases my production of ADH. So when I drink alcohol, I decrease my ADH production, which means I am urinating more often, because ADH promotes my kidneys to retain water, which is why alcohol can be dehydrating, because it decreases your ADH production, so you urinate more often, you lose a lot of water. There's a form of diabetes. It's called diabetes insipidus. Usually we associate diabetes with blood sugar levels, but this diabetes insipidus is your body in general, your body is not producing enough ADH. So you're urinating constantly and not necessarily retaining enough water. So these hormones are going to work on feedback loops, basically. We've got negative and positive feedback loops. We'll talk about more about those later, but you guys should be familiar with them from your freshman year, possibly even middle school. So looking at this one just as an example, so the stimulus here is that we're too cold. So the stimulus is that the body is too cold, and the hypothalamus is going to receive that information. The hypothalamus is going to monitor that. And so the hypothalamus then releases the thyrotropin releasing hormone. And so the thyrotropin releasing hormone is going to travel down to the anterior pituitary. Remember, the anterior pituitary releases the thyroid-stimulating hormone. So that thyroid-stimulating hormone will travel through the bloodstream because it's going to go a long distance. It's not a paracrine or an autocrine signal. It's traveling through the bloodstream, and it's going to reach the thyroid gland. And then the thyroid gland is going to secrete those thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, the thyroxine, thyroiodine, threonine. And so those thyroid hormones are going to go out to the target cells, which are out in the body tissues. And that's going to increase cellular metabolism. And when we increase cellular metabolism, we should increase temperature. Because remember, one of our main byproducts of a lot of cellular reactions is a release of heat. Okay? And so that'll increase temperature. And these levels of both hormone levels as well as temperature are going to be monitored constantly. Okay? And so they'll be feeding back that information. The amount of thyroid hormone feeds back to the pituitary. Okay? It also will feed back to the hypothalamus, but then the hypothalamus is also monitoring the temperature as well. So he said we'll look a lot closer at feedback loops in our next lecture. The goal here is to get a little bit more in depth with communication and get a kind of a handle on the endocrine system. So I know I told you you're not going to have to memorize hormones, okay, and you're not. And this is the same chart that is in your book. It's broken. You can see it here, and the second half I'll put up in just a second. Okay, but you will need to kind of pause it and take a look at this chart, and basically you're going to need to pick a hormone that interests you the most. Okay, so kind of skim through your hormones, look at what they do, and you're going to have to pick one that interests you the most. You cannot pick insulin or glucagon. Okay, you are limited on those two. No picking insulin or glucagon. So here's the second half of the chart. Like I said again, no insulin, no glucagon. Pause, skim these charts, pick a hormone that interests you the most. Okay, you need to have that ready for next class.